Why did they think like that in the first place? How come there are people in important parts of our government civil service, thinkers and movers and shakers, who think that this is a good idea and were willing to put it down in a report? Leaked dossier reveals Home Office plans to revive non-crime hate incidents. Ministers support increased use of NCHIs, that's non-crime hate incidents, despite rows sparked by Telegraph journalist Alison Pearson, screams The Telegraph. At the same time, The Guardian has it another way. Yvette Cooper to reject call to broaden extremist definition. Home Office to maintain focus on Islamist and far-right threats despite reports call for behaviour-based approach. Now, which one of those is right? I shall be trying to decide that, and also I'll be reading parts of the dossier to you, and you can make up your own minds about the sort of people who might have compiled that thing. I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds. So let's start by giving The Guardian credit. They say Yvette Cooper has rejected the call to broaden extremist definition. And, indeed, Yvette Cooper has said that she is not going to put that dossier, the recommendations of that dossier, into effect. That's what Yvette Cooper says. I hope you'll forgive me and my ancient cynicism, but the Labour Party have singularly broken every single promise they've made, both in their manifesto and having attained government. So do I believe this? No, I actually do not believe it. Although I believe it might be done on the sly rather than out in the open. Now let's have a look at this leaked dossier, should we? The leak is a document written by Andrew Gilligan and Dr. Paul Stott, and they've given it what I suppose they think of as the witty title of Extremely Confused, punning on the idea of extremism and the fact that the whole document, the whole idea is a bit of a pig's breakfast, frankly. So this is the Home Office document they have here. The government's new counter-extremism review revealed. And I went through it and marked up a few pages. You can find it online. So if you want to read the whole thing for yourself, you can. But I thought some of you might just be interested in a quick rundown. The government's rapid analytical sprint to determine its policy on extremism has been leaked to Policy Exchange. They don't say who did the leaking, but obviously somebody with an interest in what's going on. Perhaps somebody, I don't know, I'm just wildly speculating here, somebody in the Home Office who still has a conscience. The report says the UK's approach to extremism should no longer be based on ideologies of concern. In other words, they're saying it shouldn't be based on Islamism, but on a very wide range of behaviours, including violence against women and girls, spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories, an interest in gore or extreme violence, misogyny, or involvement in an online subculture called the Manosphere. Now, what he's talking about here they should be more interested in how people are behaving than in what they believe. And that was probably sparked by Axel Rudakabana's behaviour, because apparently he had no specific ideology. He just was interested in murder and mayhem. Now, you ask me my opinion, I would say that the attitude he had towards murder and mayhem may not have come from a deeply felt Muslim religious fanaticism, but it could still have been inspired by Muslim religious fanaticism, because let's face it, that's the sort of philosophy that includes violence against women and girls, spreading misinformation, conspiracy theories, and an interest in gore and extreme violence. I mean, that just about covers everything in Islam on the internet. I'm not talking about, obviously, a lot of Muslims who just don't want any part of this. But the extremist element of Islam, as perhaps typified by what's going on in Afghanistan now, is nothing more than a lot of violence against women and girls, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and a whole cultural aspect of extreme violence. So, there we are. Now, there's a subculture called the Manosphere, so they're being particular about that particular one. And again, I'm sorry, we've got to go back to Islam, because they talk about incels. Incels are involuntarily celibate men. That is, young men usually who can't get along with women, who can't find women, and who feel very frustrated. Well, let me just point out something about Islam. It allows polygamy. However, the number of women against the number of men, that is, the number of female children born against the number of men, is marginally higher. There are, I don't know, I think it's something like 51 girls to every 49 boys. It's something like that. It's not a lot. There are a few more females born, but not that many. But of course, if you have a culture where men are allowed to have more than one wife, you have a problem. How is this problem solved? Well, basically, it's solved in a few ways. In early Islam, it was very simply solved. You would go out into the rest of the world, conquer it, and then kill the men and enslave the women. That way, you would ensure yourself of a supply of women. Furthermore, if some of your own were killed in the process, that would reduce the number of men and make more women available. That's how Islam spread and developed. Unfortunately, as is often the case with that sort of a situation, and I'm not just talking about men and women, I'm just talking about this sort of multiplication game, when it reaches a barrier, then it implodes, which is basically what's happened to the Arab world. And so there are a lot of Muslim men who are basically incels. That is, they are unable to access women because the previous generation of men have raided the teenage girls of the generation of the incels. That's why you get, there's a horrific video which is in my canon of videos, which shows a 9-year-old girl being carted off in marriage to an obviously middle-aged man. And right now in Iraq, the religious authorities have allowed the marriage of 9-year-old girls in Iraq. And that's because there is a shortage of girls now. If the previous generation had a lot of multiple marriages. So that is a big problem in Islam, because when they run out of available women, you get a lot of frustrated and consequently violent men. Yeah. All right, so I've just devoted all that time to just that paragraph. That's not very... this is going to be a long video, isn't it? This approach could swamp... All right, so let's go on with this. They're talking about, don't talk about religion, talk about behaviours instead. This approach could swamp already stretched counter-extremism and counter-terror police with thousands of new cases. So what he's saying here, what this report is saying, is that if people are going to be studied just on their behaviours, then you're going to have a whole lot of people who are going to end up somewhere in the system. And this is going to overstretch the police. I mean, the police are very busy right now arresting people for Facebook posts. So, I mean, this is just going to add to their burden, is it not? And then they say the sprint decenters and downplays Islamism. And again, you see, I was talking about all of this, which is actually a lot of the features of Islamism. And the sprint says, don't think about Islamism, just talk about behaviour. Well, for sure, somebody like Axel Rudakabana should have been caught just because he was obviously an extremely disturbed young man. Now, I have seen a lot of stuff about his parents, they were involved in the Rwandan genocide. I haven't heard anything of that, and I will not start believing that until I've got, proof. No, and it sounds like his parents were really desperate to have something done about their son. They kept ringing the police, there was one on record where his father stopped him from going back to his old school. Obviously, the parents were in a terrible quandary. I don't know anything about their background. And I don't think anyone else does either. So let's just go steady on his parents until we know really what was going on. But it looks like, the kid was 17. You can't control a young man of that age anymore. What are you going to do? Lock him up. You can only do that if you have the state behind you. And the state wasn't behind either the parents or anybody else by the looks of things. Anyway, the sprint will raise concerns over freedom of speech. It says claims of two-tier policing are a right-wing extremist narrative. So anyone who complains that the police are not policing one group in the same way as they're policing another group, that makes them right-wing extremists. And then it recommends the reversal of moves to cut police use of non-crime hate incidents. So the previous government said, don't do this anymore in the wake of the Alison Pearson thing. And they say, no, let's go back to that. And then it suggests a new crime of making harmful communications online, something else that was rejected by the previous government. Well, these are all draconian responses, which, almost, I'd say at least half of the country, and probably more, believe that the police are not equal in their arrests of various types of people. I'm sure the grooming gang instance is one thing where almost everyone in the country would say that there's been two-tier policing. They might not call it that, but that's what they will acknowledge it has been. And that will make them all right-wing extremists. Now, I want to point something out to you here. In the days of, in the countries that were governed by the Communist Party, you got the best jobs if you were a member of the party. And it wasn't that easy to be a member. You had to go to their meetings. You had to show solid respect for the Communist Party. You had to have a sponsor, all the rest of it. But once you'd got your Communist Party card, then a whole lot of jobs were open to you, which, like, for instance, teaching, university places, that sort of thing. And they would not be open to the people, the proles, who were not actually members of the Communist Party. Even stuff, I suppose, like getting a job in an orchestra. Are you a member of the Communist Party? That would get you a better job. Now, they can't do that here in this country, but they can do it in another way. If you have a non-crime hate incident registered against you, and in this case, that might be just saying that there's two-tier policing, and you might have a non-crime hate incident registered against your name without you knowing about it, then that will block you from certain jobs. So, in fact, what's happening is it's like the communist system, except you won't have the Communist Party card, you'll just have the deletion of your importance because you disagree with something the government is doing, or with the way the police are acting, or whatever. You see how dangerous that is? I'm not saying that is a deliberate policy. What I am saying is that anyone with a socialist turn of mind, generally speaking, trusts the government far too much. And, by the way, anyone in government with a socialist mind trusts the people far too little. Again, I've taken off at a tangent, haven't I? So the sprint is going to be, the sprint was going to, if the recommendations of the sprint were taken as they are written down, then a lot of people are going to be tarred as right-wing extremists, and there'll be a new crime of making harmful communications, and the police should be using more non-crime hate incidents. Now, I'm just a housewife who is looking at the news, and I can see those problems, those social problems, like the ones I told you about with the Communist Party card. I can see those down the line over that. And this was written by, obviously, respected people with good jobs in the Home Office. I would like to know why they couldn't see that, and I could. But the other question I have is, why did they think like that in the first place? How come there are people in important parts of our government civil service, thinkers and movers and shakers, who think that this is a good idea and were willing to put it down in a report? Now, obviously, other people don't think it's a good idea. And as I said, Yvette Cooper is saying that she is not taking this into she's not going to swallow this one. But again, as I say, the idea is out there now, and it will be sort of fermenting in the heads of our elite governing classes. And so I'm not entirely sure that bit by bit those won't come in anyway. Right, That's that out the way. Now, what else did I note down here? There is a case, as the former counter-terror policing chief, Neil Basu, has said, for creating non-extremist version of Prevent, aiming to interdict people such as the Southport killer with an interest in violence but no obvious ideological or political motivation. Yeah, and there is definitely a case for that. That the reason that Rudy Kibana was kicked off Prevent was he didn't have, apparently, he didn't have any particular ideology. He just liked to talk and think and build his life around violence, extreme violence. And as I've said, the fact that he went to a kindergarten and went for little children, that is the sort of thing that has been done by Islamists. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they hadn't inspired him. Again, Tommy Robinson said that Rudy Kibana had been to mosque in Belmarsh. Yep, I believe Tommy Robinson. I don't think he was lying. It's quite possible, though, that Rudy Kibana went to mosque because he saw that as a way of getting in with the crowd rather than from any particular religious conviction. But as I keep saying, this is the sort of thing you expect from Islam. And so it could very well have been the sort of thing that inspired Rudy Kibana, even if he had no particular religious feelings about it. The recommendation by a previous reviewer of Prevent, William Shawcross, that the current programme is the wrong place for dealing with the psychologically unstable has been ignored, even repudiated in the Sprint. So that's something that the Sprint report is not taking any notice of. The Sprint de-centres and downplays ideology in general and Islamism in particular. Just ignores it. The government should, it says, take an ideologically agnostic approach, not basing His Majesty's government's approach on a definition of extremism or specific ideologies, but on behaviours and activity of concern. In fact, the whole report has tended to ignore Islamism, and you have to wonder why. Restrictions on the use of non-crime hate incidents brought in by the last government should be reversed, it says, risking further anger about free speech and diversion of police resources. You know, because if the restrictions are lifted, you're going to get a lot of people making spurious complaints, and this will divert police resources, and it'll also make people a lot angrier than they already are. And of course, the Alison Pearson thing made the British police a laughing stock. A new criminal offence of making harmful communications is floated. Well, what is a harmful communication? It risks criminalising speech on the basis that it caused someone offence. In Great Britain, Islamists are responsible for 94% of all deaths caused by terrorism since 1999, and around 88% of injuries caused by terrorism over the same period. Last year, Islamists accounted for 80% of the police's counter-terror caseload, 75% of MI5s and 63% of terrorists in custody. But the Sprint's Understand paper devotes the same amount of space, 1 page, to Islamist extremism as it did to people who had conspiracy theories, pro-Khalistan extremism, that's Sikhs. I mean, Sikhs, for goodness sake, Sikhs, they are just about the most law-abiding, solid citizens you can find in Britain. I have a lot of respect for Sikhs. Extreme misogyny and environmental extremism. Well, although I find the environmental extremists a bloody nuisance and possibly murderous in some cases, I haven't yet seen any of them do any mass bombings. I mean, they have caused some deaths with their stopping traffic, they're stopping ambulances going through, so they are to be taken seriously, but not like Islamism, because most of them will not kill themselves. I mean, that may get there eventually, of course. Many of these supposed other extremisms simply do not meet the test of causing harm to national security or safety, or even often the test of extremism. The Sprint section on conspiracy theories, for instance, admits that many of those who believe in them do so without holding any deeper commitment to recognisable extremist ideology, e.g. they have a belief in UFO cover-ups or in alternate explanations of 9/11. And I want to go back to Peter Lynch because I cannot forget that man. He held up a placard which had a lot of conspiracy theories written on it. And because of that, he was put in prison for 3 years. And it is said that he killed himself. Do I believe that? I have my doubts. Right. The Sprint divides misogynists into subgroups such as men's rights activists. Well, that would be, I suppose, Sargon of Akkad was something of a men's right activist, wasn't he? Pick-up artists and involuntary celibates or incels. And on misogyny, even if you accept the government's view that it should come under extremist umbrella, the Sprint already looks incomplete. There is little reference to the grooming gangs, which so blighted the lives of girls and young women in scores of towns and cities. It not only blighted, but are blighting. We know it is still going on. There's also a long case study on the Earth Liberation Front, an eco-extremist group active against inanimate objects such as buildings and phone masts in the 1990s, but whose last reported attack in Britain was more than 10 years ago. 10 years, just like the government are talking about the EDL, which is well over 10 years gone as well. Now, again, I have to ask this question. How come movers and shakers and intelligent people who work for the Home Office, how come they came out with this paper? With this set of advice? How come? The only Islamist case study is much briefer. It concerns Anjem Chowdhury's Al-Mujahiroon, which by 2016 had direct and provable links to almost a quarter of all Islamist terrorists convicted in the UK. So you really can't ignore him, can you? Including the UK's first ever Islamic terror attacker and the murderers of drummer Lee Rigby in 2013. Al-Mujahiroon supporters went on to commit 2 further major terror attacks, London Bridge, Borough Market and Fishmongers Hall in 2019. And none of this is mentioned in the case study. So at this point, you might suggest, you might be forgiven for thinking that perhaps the people who wrote this had an agenda. Because I don't see how you can ignore all of this in a paper on how to deal with terrorism, while it at the same time suggests that we have to clamp down on what ordinary people can say. And what was it, malicious communications or something. It wasn't quite malicious. They had something else, something like uncomfortable communications. It's up there. I don't remember. If I remember, I'll put it on the, I'll write it up here, text over the video in the edit. So it will stop people like me from criticising the misogynistic and violent aspects of Islam, while at the same time ignoring the study of these terrorist events. You have to think that either they're very stupid or they do have an agenda. The Sprint's playing down of ideology in general and Islamism in particular risks becoming a major victory for what William Shawcross, a previous reviewer of the main counter-extremist programme Prevent, called the concerted campaign by some, including a number of Islamist groups, to undermine and delegitimise Prevent. Another reason why Islamism is Britain's most serious extremist threat is that it has significantly greater institutional presence than any other form of UK extremism. And by institutional presence, it can run an entire gamut. If anyone remembers in the Hare Hills election, when I've forgotten his name now, but the winner of a council place, instead of talking about potholes in the streets and local services, when he won his seat, shouted that this was a victory for Gaza. And he is a member of the an institution, the institution of local government. This goes all the way up to the five MPs who are now in our lawmaking institution on the strength of the Muslim vote for hardline Islamism. They may say it's for Gaza, but we all know what that means. And of course, influencing or controlling some mosques, private schools, media outlets, charities and pressure groups. This goes unmentioned in the Sprint documents seen by Policy Exchange. Another subject not given much attention is the growing agitation around blasphemy. Despite the Batley Grammar School incident, which forced a teacher into hiding, where almost 4 years later he remains, and campaigns against films such as The Lady of Heaven. And The Lady of Heaven is interesting because it was made by a Shia group, and it gave more weight to the Shia interpretation of Islam, which caused a lot of Sunni Muslims to mob theatres that were showing this. So here on British streets, we are having a sectarian fight between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It's bad enough with them having their riots at odd places in the Middle East. We don't need them here. And it completely ignores that aspect. The Southport murders committed by Axel Rudakubana, who in the Home Secretary's account was obsessed with massacre or extreme violence, but who lacked a clear ideology, might seem to be a clear example of the phenomenon described by McCallum. There is much about the case we still do not know. For instance, what was his family background? I said before, we don't know. What about, he's obviously disturbed. Why wasn't he taken into some sort of medical attention earlier on? It's quite obvious he had a psychiatric problem. Why was he not, was it because of ideas of, cultural sensitivity? I remember there was a case in Haringey where a little girl called Victoria Climbier was supposed to be being looked after by relatives. I don't know if they really were relatives. The social workers who went round there noticed the little girl was afraid of her so-called aunt, but didn't do anything about it because she thought, well, they're Nigerians. They have a different attitude to children and the children to their elders. And the child was killed, died in the most dreadful circumstances. And I'm wondering whether Rudakabana was not taken into some sort of medical care earlier for similar reasons. We don't know. This analysis talks about Starmer's words and the leaked Sprint documents, which they say suffer from serious confusion. The Prime Minister explicitly confuses extreme violence with extremism and terrible acts with terrorism. In her own statement, the Home Secretary spoke of the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. But again, this is a confusion, or at least a conflation. Are, for instance, postcode wars between teenage gangs, youth violence, which is often extreme, often terrible and usually organised, now to be counted as extremist or terrorist? The Sprint likewise risks extending the definition of extremism to cover any shocking crime, any bad belief or any nasty social phenomenon about which we're worried. In doing so, it runs the risk that those fighting extremism and terrorism will be damagingly diverted for their actual job. In his statement on the Southport case, Starmer also confused policy failings with what were in fact operational failings. So here we're talking about, Starmer was talking about Rudakabana, who should have been detained in some way, but was not. That's an operational failing. Rudakabana had come to the attention of the authorities, showing them he was plainly dangerous as many as 15 times over several years before he killed anyone. In a more operationally effective justice or policing system, action would have been taken against him sooner. Yeah, and so the question then is, was action not taken against him for the same reason that the police didn't take action against the so-called, what they like to call the grooming gangs? We don't know, and we are not told. But he wasn't taken, he wasn't detained, he wasn't sectioned, nothing. Why? Oh, we're not given the reasons for that. As Hall puts it, this is not about definitions, it's an organisational issue, and I think a major one. It suggests the need for a wholly new capability to deal with those motivated by non-instrumental extreme violence. And he says Policy Exchange agrees with this. Now we have this. This is something else, the Sprint says. Extremism should include spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories that undermine democracy. You know, there's nothing that undermines democracy as powerfully as stifling free speech. And they just don't seem to get that. So they're talking about misinformation. As a matter of fact, what caused the Southport riots was the misinformation that the government was feeding us. That is, that we don't know what was going on. They knew what was going on. They should have said what was going on. They should have told us exactly. But because of the suppression, frustration boiled up. And anyone should realise that. And yet these people are talking about clamping down on the spreading of misinformation. And here, Recommendation 18 is to reverse the previous government's code of practice, which aimed to limit the recording of non-crime hate incidents. Well, I've been through the effect those have already. NCHIs are intensely controversial, criticised as a waste of police time and an avenue for malicious complaints and chilling free speech. We know that. They don't seem to know it. Sprint also says The accused should be told of the NCHI and given the opportunity to contest it, although this is not an absolute right and some are not told. So as I said, some people go through life wondering why they're not getting those jobs. On the extreme right wing, the Sprint enters difficult waters in declaring that claims of two-tier policing are an example of right-wing extremist narrative which is leaking into mainstream debates. It certainly is. This is highly contentious. Indeed, claims of differential or two-tier policing have long been part of our policies. The grooming gang scandal, for instance, is an undeniable and officially acknowledged example of two-tier policing. Well, I was talking about that. Once accepted within government, how will the suggestion that two-tier policing as a right-wing extremist narrative be weaponised at the local and national level by civil servants, senior police and counter-extremism practitioners? There's an obvious risk here of tarring significant swathes of the public as far right. And as I said, this will affect their job prospects, their life prospects. So, under the list of harms which result from extremism, we're informed child sexual exploitation and abuse as a result of extremist beliefs is perpetrated by Satanist groups such the Order of Nine Angles, 764, and Com Network. However, given the accusations of racial abuse towards some of the white victims of grooming, is the government confident Rochdale, Rotherham, Telford and other towns should go unmentioned here? The numbers involved in that type of grooming, indeed the numbers already convicted, far exceed those involved in the groups listed above. Again, the Satanist groups. Again, therefore, one might question whether precious resources are being deployed in the right place. And one may also wonder why Sprint is ignoring is not making more of this particular problem. On the basis, this is the proposals for action. On the basis, presumably, of the analysis contained within the Understand document, the CE Sprint capping paper proposes that the government undertake 5 shifts in its counter-extremism approach with a view to strengthening a punitive approach. Well, they've already got a pretty punitive approach on things like Facebook posts. Increasing the focus on prevention. Yeah, well, we can't complain about that. The only problem is, what are they trying to prevent? What focus do they have? Taking a behaviour-based and ideologically agnostic approach, there should be another section that deals with people who have violent fantasies, but not an ideological focus. Adopting an enhanced online approach, that's clamping down on what people say online, and achieving effective cross-government delivery. Well, maybe. So there are some proposals here. I'm going to wrap it up there because, not only is this getting very long, but my throat is getting sore. So you want my rundown on this whole document? Not this document, this is a critique of the Sprint document, and it is that the people who wrote it either cannot or refuse to see that the biggest problem we have in our society right now, by no means the only one, but the hugest problem is Islamist fanaticism. And the other thing that they are refusing to talk about is that this Islamist fanaticism comes from clumps of Muslim settlement in our society. And as long as those are there in that way, then there will always be a constant outward supply of Islamist fanaticism. Unless the government interrupts these clumps in some way. I honestly don't know how they're going to do it. But maybe that's something that the Muslim citizens of our country should be thinking of as well. All right. Well, I've got to edit this. It's probably very, very, very long. I might cut some of it down. So if you see some jerks, you'll know it's because I've just cut the video down because it's just got unmanageably long. Yvette Cooper says she is going to reject this document. And as I said at the beginning of the video, do you believe her? And do you think that any organisation that came up with something as egregious as this plan of action, which involved just closing society down, reducing our ability to speak freely, and increasing the number of police, the amount of police involvement in our everyday lives? Don't you think that this means that there is something really unpleasant going on in our civil service? And the fact is, the ideas are out there. Whether Yvette Cooper takes them on or not, they are circulating. They are circulating in the Cabinet Office. They're circulating in the Home Office. They're circulating among the politicians. Whether they're rejected now or not, we have to consider that bit by bit, they're going to creep in. Unless there is a very robust pushback against them. And quite frankly, I don't see that robustness coming from our present government. Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.